Okay, welcome everybody to this Scrutiny Management hearing with the Policy and Resources Committee. Today we're focusing on the issues contained in the Government Work Plan. I'm Deputy Yvonne Burford, and with me on the panel today are the Vice President of the Scrutiny Management Committee, that's Deputy Simon Fairclough, Deputy Adrian Gabriel, and also the Principal Officer, Mr Mark Huntingdon. Following this session, the Scrutiny Management Committee will decide if any further review activity is necessary, and a Hansard transcript of the hearing will be available in due course in addition to the live stream. So if everyone can kindly ensure that their phones are turned to silent, please. I'll now turn to our witnesses, and if you could introduce yourselves, please, starting with Deputy Soulsby. Thank you.
Deputy Heidi Soulsby, Vice President, P&R.
Peter Fairbush, President of P&R.
Mark Hellier, Member of P&R and Treasury Representative.
Dave Mahoney, Member of P&R and Lead for Employer and Property.
Thank you. Right, so we'll move straight into the questions, and we'd like to start with the update statement that you gave to the Assembly a fortnight ago, Deputy Fairbush. And in relation to the Public Sector Transformation Plan, you stated, quote, the scale of the anticipated savings meant that the initial expenditure would be recovered relatively quickly, and there would be an ongoing benefit. However, in attempting to verify these figures, it has become apparent that the programmes of work were too complex, too ambitious, and simply not deliverable. This leaves us in a position where current expectations in terms of savings are pathetic compared to previous promises. So, I mean, and it's true, once again, planned savings have not been delivered, the shortfall in 2021 being around 6 million. In that statement, you place the blame for this firmly at the feet of the last Assembly, of which, of course, you are a member. So my question is this: why has it taken 2 years for the committee to realise the inadequacy of the transformation plan, and when will the savings or lack of them become this Assembly's responsibility?
I don't know where you've derived the fact that it took the Policy and Resources Committee 2 years to come to that decision. I came to that decision within the first 2 or 3 weeks of my presidency of Policy and Resources, if not before. Two Policy and Resources Committees, firstly the committee in 2019, I think it was, voted 8.9 million towards 16.7 million, and then we, in 2021, voted the balance between those two figures. The figures that were originally projected as a saving was £7.4 million per annum after an introductory period, because obviously you don't press the button, the light doesn't come on straight away. During the early part of my tenure as President of P&R, we suddenly got a report saying that that had been reduced to 3.7 million. Now, there was no explanation as to why it had been reduced from 7.4 to 3.7. It looked to me as just somebody had done halved it. Albeit it said, I can remember the line in the report that we had said that we hope to do better. Well, doing better this year will be £420,000, i.e. a lot worse. Next year in the budget, it's projected that there could be a net saving of £1 million because it's 1.5, but then you've got to take off £500,000 or something. So it has been it's been a situation thereby that altogether at the moment, I think at the end of August, £11.5 million or thereabouts has been spent. Can't tell you what was spent in September because those figures are not yet available, but it's going to be a bit more than £11.5 million. But the point in relation to that is I'm not saying that every penny that has been spent has been wasted. I'm just saying that every penny that's been spent is not going to reduce the savings or produce the savings that we thought. Now, in relation to transformation, Deputy Soulsby and Deputy Mahoney will deal with initial points in connection with that and say what's been done, what's anticipated, where we're going to go from there, because they've both been, as we all have, heavily involved in that. Now, you made the point that, like every member of, I think of the current P&R, only one member was a member of P&R last time, and only of the current 5 members of P&R, only 3 of us were members of the last Assembly, because Deputy Mahoney and Deputy Hellier have only been in the States now for a couple of years. But the decisions weren't taken. Well, decisions are always taken by the Assembly, I accept that, in theory, and in actual legality. But in reality, the plan was promulgated by others. But there's no point looking backwards now. We've got to look forwards as to where we are and to do the best we can with the situation. Perhaps if I could ask Deputy Salisbury to comment further.
Well, I can say that from the last term, I was on public record saying I did not believe that you could make £7.4 million savings on the back of the way that was being approached, which was to get rid of a lot of managers. And I did calculations, and I think I wrote an article in the Guernsey Press. Calculations that HSC didn't have the managers that were believed that we could get rid of, because it was all based on the number of managers to staff ratio. And that's fine if you're in a big service operation and you think you've got too many managers to staff, but it didn't take into account the differences between the different types of committees and what they did. So I took the whole of HSC and analysed those management figures. And of course, it included people who didn't have huge numbers reporting in. It included people like emergency department consultants and people who are qualified, the chief nurse and the medical director. They don't have lots and lots of people directly reporting in that way. So it completely misunderstood the structure of the public sector. But we took it on, and we were told from when we took office, we were told that the savings weren't going to be there, but we were told everything had a RAG status of green, everything was fantastic. And then we got to July last year, and we were told we need the next tranche of money. So that was the extra 7.8 million. And said, well, the savings aren't what we thought they would be, but it's compelling, and we really believe it. This is what we were told by the senior management at the time. We, as a committee, when it came to us, we said, we're not happy about that. We want to see more on this. The reasons for those savings to be less than they were projected before is because the then senior leadership team and ourselves said we want to see those savings verified, which meant that after that work had been done by the finance team, the validation was down to 3.8 million. But still, we thought there was still a compelling case. The need for transformation is absolutely there. The whole concept behind what it's trying to do, digitalise, put things online, make it more user friendly, and focused on the users, so for people, so they can do their returns, they can get a driving licence and apply for that in the comfort of their own home at times that suit them. So there was absolutely, and then other benefits were absolutely listed that made sense. So we told them to go away, come back again. And we supported it on the back of the strong assurances we had from the then digital lead and from the project lead that they were convinced that the savings were there, and there were more to be made. That lessons had been learnt from phase one, which had been approved in the previous term, and that we would get more challenge in there. That so we know more that was going on. So that's when we approved it, but and things were still showing green. But by the end of that year, the interim chief executive, as he was then, head of the public service, believed he needed to put in what they call SRO and a MyGov director to replace people we had there, and they really got into the nitty and gritty of it. And they actually were finding out what was going on. And it was on the back of that we said, OK, we'll then try and phase the introduction. So that's how we've led to the vehicle licensing department moving, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why that was done. But then as we were getting nearer to that, it became more and more obvious that the actual digital stuff, the stuff that we needed, hadn't been done, and very, very quickly we were finding that everything had been shown green and everything was fine, and then all of a sudden it went amber and red in a very short space of time. So but in that time we were given assurances that everything was working swimmingly, we were all fine, and then we went from amber to red very quickly, and that's when it was escalated up, and then Deputy Fairbrash, Chief Minister, made a statement in the Assembly, because he thought it was really important that people knew very quickly what was happening on that front.
Indeed, that was the trigger for the statement, because of course it came just a couple of weeks after your normal routine statement. Yeah. So that moves our question that I was going to ask you later. So thank you for that. So in the statement, you talked about the significant shortfall in the staff resource available to implement this Assembly's government work plan, which indeed follows on just from what you were saying, Deputy Salisbury. And my committee's had similar confirmation from other committees in their recent hearings. What plan does PNR have to ensure that the States has the staff resources available to deliver this revised and already pruned down plan?
I think the real issue is, as a case everywhere, is finding the resource to do anything. We know there are issues in other departments, within health, education, getting people to be. It's a lot of it is linked to all the capital work we're doing. So we've got people that we need to take out of their normal work area to be able to focus on the capital projects, but you can't backfill them with other staff. And I think we need to understand it's not going to be very easy to find those people. It's not about the money. It's actually being able to find those people in a very hungry market. So from what we need to do is actually start honing down what is in the plan even more. And I think it's going to mean we've got to look very, very carefully at the capital projects we're undertaking, because we literally do not have the bandwidth to be able to do it all. And we've got staff who are really, really overstretched because they can't do it all. The good thing about the plan is it's shown what we didn't know before we had the plan was quite the extent that things were going on. We've honed it down, but now, given the circumstances we're in, the wider changes that have been happening in the world that are impacting us, that we really do need to hone it right down.
And so you're suggesting that the impact, and there will be an impact, I think we all know that, but the impact will be on capital projects?
We need to look at it all in the round, because clearly there are recovery actions that are involved in this as well. But from a capital point of view, we're looking at the same people to be able to do all these things, and we can't clone them. And that is our fundamental issue. So we're going to have to look at the capital projects that we really do need to do. And that's going to be, it's going to be a political decision. It's going to be a very difficult one.
And it's a difficult thing to say. Can I just add?
Yeah, sure.
Difficult thing to say. When I came back into the States 6.5 years ago, I had this view that there was an overblown civil service, that there were people sitting around, not quite under sun lamps all day or having a little snooze or go for a coffee break, but not far off that in some regard. I can say, and particularly knowledge gained over the last 2 years as in my current position, that the resources are stretched to the absolute limit. Our civil servants, we've got many good quality civil servants, have worked not only because of COVID and the other crises that we've had, but even business as usual. They've worked over and above what can be reasonably expected of them. And some of them are pretty washed out and tired, and they've still got considerable challenges. So as Heidi has said, that there isn't a pool of people we could just go out and say, well, we'd like to employ you to do this role, this policy role, that role, because they can earn more doing other jobs, and they can be probably better considered by the public doing other jobs, if I could put that judiciously. So it's going to be very, very difficult. And the truth of the matter is, the government work plan, well led over the last 2 years by Deputy Salisbury, it's still expecting the states to do too much. We haven't got the resources, both financial and personnel, to be able to do what all of us, all 40 of us, the 38 deputies plus the 2 ordinary representatives are being asked to do. I don't know, Mark, if you want to add anything in relation to finances.
No, just that notwithstanding the pressure that we have on resources, the cost levels are rising significantly. So we're expecting to spend another 10% on the budget next year. So the revenue expenditure is forecast to go from 532 million this year to 573, primarily due to increased costs due to inflation, but also the nature of some of the staff that we're having to employ. HSC is a good example. Lots and lots of agency staff now. They're far more expensive. They cost commissions. They cost movement expenses, rental allowances, which have now been extended to 4 years to try and stabilise the churn. But the pressure is not just coming from a lack of resource, but it's actually increasing the cost of doing things at the same time.
I see that. Thank you for that. I think that sort of leads slightly to a question again that we would have had later, which was about these capital projects. At the moment, the States is still churning out not just things in the GWP, but I'd give you the example also of the pool marina that an investigation was put into. Do you think that at the moment, and the other one I would cite, which was in the GWP, was the runway extension, which I know is quite controversial. But do you think that we are actually also spending too much of a limited staff resource on investigating these projects, which realistically may never be able to come to fruition?
I think it depends what the project is. I mean, you've mentioned, I know it's just, for example, the pool marina. That will come back, as I understand it, to the states next April, sometime around then, March, April, May time. Let's say April for the purpose of this discussion. Now, that could be a project that could actually earn, over a period of time, the states a considerable amount of money, because it would be a marina available for bigger vessels, bigger yachts. You can see I don't even know the terminology right as a non-sailor. And just make Guernsey more attractive to people who would be spending money. There are other projects which we could invest time and resource on, which are not going to give us a return. Now, we've got to do things. I mean, already budgeted, we've got the 6-year hospital phase 1 and phase 2 project. Phase 1 to be finished, June, July of 24, or the other 4 years afterwards. That clearly is not going to give us an economic benefit so much, but we've got to have that to make sure we've got a first-rate hospital service. That money's already in the bag, unless Deputy Header tells me otherwise. That's in the bag to pay for that. So it really depends on the project. I don't think you can have an absolute yes or no. It will really depend on what there is, what's available and what we can do.
And until such a project has been investigated in detail by staff and, on occasion, consultants, you don't know whether it's going to be a viable
some
project.
Some you do at the outset, and some you need. There's no absolute yes or no.
Okay. I'd like to touch...
Sure. On that, Deputy Burford, has there been enough consideration of the prioritisation of capital projects? We've mentioned a few there, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree, you know, hospital is important, schools are probably important, but has there been enough consideration of the prioritisation of capital projects, and what are the most important things?
Well, in a higher level, yes, there has. So we've got must-do, delivery and pipeline. So we have said, well, these things are going off into the long grass because we can't do them now. So we've already done that. It's not as if we're saying, here are all the capital projects that we're going, and now we'll say, we've got too many. We've actually, that has happened, just like we have done in terms of extant resolutions from a policy point of view. But we need to look at it in more detail, is what we're saying. We've got a list of those that are in that development phase. But we need to say, well, how many of those should we just stop now? And we're getting more and more into saying, well, we can do less and less and less, and focus on doing small things well rather than trying to do too many things badly.
And so following on from that, I mean, that is a key question, isn't it? What should we not be doing as much as what we should be doing? Absolutely,
and I think that's something as a committee we're looking at trying to bring forward through the latter course of this year, because I think that we need to be more. We can't wait to next July. We need to be looking at this in a more timely fashion, bearing in mind all the things that have happened over the last year that have changed the wider picture that we're working in. And so how might that manifest itself, Deputy Soulsby? Is that something you propose to come back to the States with? We've got to agree that, but what we need to do in the first instance is actually discuss this with States members. I mean, we are an assembly after all, and really gauge opinions and views about how we do approach it. It doesn't mean that we've got all the answers to it, and I think it's something we very much need to work together to come up with something that we think makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. A point I want to touch on just very briefly here, perhaps in an effort to wrap it up, because it's been a long-running thing, but I think we might have come to a conclusion on it, is the infamous 200 posts that were going to be removed from the civil service. Now, in your update statement, you said that figure was in fact 99. Yeah. But you also confirmed to me during that meeting... It's
60 of them are Agilicis.
It's 60, is it? Well, I was going to ask...
And that was always part of that sum, because we're talking about these posts, the posts for the savings. And so part of those savings were including those posts. But because we questioned the same thing. We said, well, you've got 100, where are they? And we found, well, actually, those savings that were included originally when it was first put to previous committee included those people being transferred from the States to Agilicis.
But do you not think that might not be legitimate to include them, because we might not be paying for them now as civil servants, but we're paying for them through the Agilicis
that is
contract.
And I hate to say it, and I don't go out there bashing what happened in the previous states at all. But in that instance, that is what was decided, that how it would be manifested. But actually, there are savings within the whole Agilicis contract, such that I think this year we're approving a reduced, in real terms, budget for Agilicis, because that's part of the agreed costings over this period of time. I haven't got all the details of what those numbers are, but it takes into account that. So in many ways, you could say, well, that is part of the saving that's been transferred.
Well, I think the contract was always designed to work like that. So,
Yes.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that we're not paying for it one way or another. So, okay, I think I'll hand over now to Deputy Fairclough. Thank you.
Yeah, we've touched on the transformation programme. It was clarified in your statement, Deputy Fairbrush, there was a planned spend of 16.7, with 11.5 of that spent to date. It was also stated that if the 3.7 recurring savings were made, that you would be delighted, and I quote. What is now the realistic financial return that we can expect from the programme in terms of one-off savings and also recurring savings?
Well, it's being looked at on an annual basis. This year, i.e. this calendar year 2022, is going to total £420,000. Next year it's budgeted, but I emphasise the word budgeted, for £1 million net savings. So I cannot say to you, because I don't believe the information exists, that your question, which is a very fair one, that we're going to save e.g. £2 million per annum recurring. I don't believe that is the situation. But of course, as Deputy Salisbury said, there's been lots of IT improvements, if I could use that, because the idea is to make services available to people not 24 hours a day in some instances, in the sense they can do things online that they would have had to come into a state's office and do before. Now, that's got a value. Difficult to say what the value is, but it's a value to the citizen, because they can address their own affairs and do things that they otherwise would have needed to take an hour out of their day when they can perhaps do it at 9 o'clock on a Saturday night or 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. So they're going to save their own time. It's going to be of value to them and their lives.
And I think it's important to understand that the approach we are taking, working with Head of Public Service on this, in terms of how we're going to do the transformation. That the real issue with the approach that was taken at the start was the whole Big Bang thing, and looking at the whole organisation turning up in the air and coming down with a completely different way of operating. And in a very big and unwieldy organisation of different parts and very different parts, that is quite a challenge. And I think we want to take a much more focused approach, and an approach that works much more closely with those particular areas. And I think there was concern from the start about people not knowing what was going on in different areas. And I think if we're going to make changes, as we have done before, I mean, it is possible to do it, as we did in health, that you focus on the particular areas and work in that way, in a more part of the whole expectation that how you can make things work better. And I think creating these big projects that seem to be divorced from the people working in them never really work. You've got to work with people within that organisation, and that way you'll make things change. And so that is the approach that we are taking now.
So have steps been taken to stop any additional spend? For example, has the internal transformation team been reduced or disbanded?
We have stopped parts of the work that were ongoing and focusing on where we can make change now with the funding that we've got right now. So focusing on register of contact details, web application, and driver licensing is one area. But that is being developed. How we're going to go forward is very much being developed by the head of the public service at the moment with his team.
But also in relation to your point, as Heidi made before, we were told things at a certain level were green. All of a sudden, it was like very quick changing traffic lights that went from amber to red. Now, that doesn't mean that those things have got to be ended. It means they've got to be dealt with in a different way. So people will have to address those. Some things we will not be able to do. Some things we'll be able to do, but in a different way and over a longer period. And
so how many people are still working in that team on these kind of projects?
I can't instantly give you that figure.
Well, it's not one team. That's the point.
That's it. It's spread across a variety of
It is,
streams.
but it's a partnership. And I say this is how it was decided to do it at the very start, a partnership approach between States of Guernsey staff and Agilisys staff. And so it's what we do with Agilisys staff as much as what we do with the internal staff. So we have stopped work within Agilisys on this, what is a part of the Pillar 2 work. And we've just said we've focused on specific core areas to make sure that we can start delivering in those areas rather than spreading everything across all manner of different bits of work.
Okay. Still on the theme of transformation, Deputy Salisbury, please could you update the panel on the progress of one of the government work plan's 4 priorities this term, namely reshaping government?
Yes, and I'm quite happy to. Yes, we did. I had an update to Policy and Resources Committee on Tuesday. We will be presenting some draft ideas, proposals that we've got to the what's called the President-to-President meeting on Friday. That covers particular proposals, but also some discussion points that we'd like further information on. So that is still happening, and we're still on course to report early next year.
So so what is going to come back to the States then?
The policy letter is saying what we want to do. I mean, we're not going to say everybody what our plans are at the moment. We still need to go and have consultation. It's just working as the subcommittee on what we think it might be the things that we need to change. But I'm not going to say what those are now because that's what subcommittee hasn't signed off anything, and neither has P&R. Thank
you. Committees are supposed to be increasingly working together this term, I think it's fair to say. Do you feel that that's the case? I mean, P&R holds regular meetings of the presidents, the meeting that Deputy Salisbury has just referred to. What have those meetings contributed to solving some of these problems that you've been talking about?
I think they've been good. I mean, I'm not just saying because it was my idea, but I think they've been good because it's allowed us to share information with other committees and them to share via their president's information with us, because we're all busy, and although we're transparent, and I don't just mean we, I mean every States Committee I believe is transparent in the way that they conduct their affairs. Just talking to the presidents gives you information, they can ask questions, you can learn what they're doing next week, next month, in 3 months' time. On a practical and regular basis. So I think certainly I can say I've been well informed in those meetings by my colleagues. Now, equally, I think because there are only 40 of us in the States, that it would be helpful if we could meet in little groups. And members will recall, because all 3 of you took up the invitation, that I wrote to States members some time ago saying, let's meet in little groups. I can't remember those exact words I used. You 3 took it up. I think out of 40 people, and clearly I exclude my colleagues because they see me regularly anyway, but 2/3 didn't bother replying. Now, the idea of that was and you were party to those conversations, to have a free-flowing conversation. Nothing was held back. You could ask what you wanted. You told me what you thought. I told you what I thought. Those are the kind of communications we should have. We don't just have fixed States meetings where we exchange views and make speeches on policy letters that are before the States. And
I welcomed that opportunity, Deputy Fabris, as you know, and found it very constructive. But what does it say to you that 2/3 of members, as you say, didn't take up the offer?
I found it disappointing because you never expect 100%, do you, in anything in real life? But the idea was to be open and frank, and I found that everybody who attended, he or she, were open and frank. They expressed their views, asked questions, and I hope they got the same impression from me, because that was the intent. So it doesn't matter that it might be something I don't normally agree with on States members. I still respect their views.
Deputy Burford.
Okay. Talking of saving money and efficiency savings, will P&R pursue efficiency across the States where opportunities exist? And I'll give you one example. Bringing forward the review of primary education, knowing as it does that there is a significant opportunity there due to the overcapacity in the primary system for saving money.
I think in relation to that, because we have a committee system, even though we are the senior committee, we've got our own mandate. Education is for education. I know that sounds like environment's for environment. We've all got responsibilities in relation to that. So I think that question would be, I'll answer it, but I think it would be better directed to the President of Education, Sport and Culture. Now, my understanding, and if I've got it wrong, I apologise, but this is my understanding, is that they've got their hands full dealing with secondary education at the moment and other matters, and they would be seen to address, they see a course, it will depend what happens in the election, etc., as that being a matter for the next Assembly.
Okay, thank you.
That's my understanding.
And of course, if we're going to do something different, add to it. I mean, I totally understand the logic of why you say it should be looked at, but then something else will need to go. Would need to go, and it doesn't necessarily need to be education. Particularly, it depends on how technical it is. I would say you probably do need some knowledge within education to do it, but something somewhere will have to give.
Okay, thank you.
Just picking up on a point that Deputy Furbush has made there, because it's an interesting observation about the committee mandates and the committee responsibilities. And I don't think there would be many people who disagree with you about that, but we've very recently, in fact, currently seeing a number of deputies looking at the area of energy policy, for example. Isn't that a case of deputies working on an area of responsibility that is under the mandate of a committee?
Yeah, I think they're entitled to look at it. You don't have to be on the education department or committee to look at education and have an interest in it. And if for example, you've used energy, and I'm on that group, Deputy Hellier's on that group, Deputy Mahoney's on that group. I haven't done much about it. They've done quite a lot. But in relation to that, if say 10 or 12 states members, dealing with the point that Deputy Burford said, wanted as a group to address that, then the way to do it would be, as being done with the energy, is to do it, then speak in due course, as I'm sure will happen, to the relevant committees who have responsibility for energy, to say, this is the work we've done. Do you think it's helpful? What do you think? Because every committee there isn't a committee that's underworked, as far as I'm aware. So any assistance they get from somebody else is fine. I don't think you can say that just because you're not a member of environment or education, you can't deal with environmental or educational matters.
I think the question maybe is more about communication with those committees and knowing that people are working on areas. I don't think anyone has any necessarily any problem with deputies working on pieces of work. Everybody ultimately is working, I'm sure, in the best interests of the island.
Absolutely.
But it's the way that is done and the communication with committees and knowing that things are going on, I suppose, is the point.
Yeah, I think sometimes you've got to think, there'd be little point in me going and say, I'm just using this hypothetically, I hasten to add, I'm interested in education. So I'm going to do something about education. I say to the Education Committee, I'm going to do something about education. Little point me doing that till I've actually done something, done some research, carried out some work, and then say, I've done this, that, and the other. What do you think?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you think that approach is perhaps a factionalistic or driving a wedge between the Assembly?
No, I don't think it is, because I think it's helpful. I think if that particular group that Deputy Fairclough has referred to has said, this is our information, we're only keeping it to ourselves, we're not telling you, well, that would be rather pathetic. But to say we've done this research, this is what we've done so far, then it should be discussed with other committees and other states members to say, what do you think? What do you think? So I don't think it's factional, I think it's actually informational.
Thank you.
A couple of questions I think perhaps best aimed at Deputy Hellier. In the government work plan, it states that the Policy and Resources Committee would like to pilot a public-private partnership scheme during this term to determine the overall fit for the states of such an approach. Has any project been identified in this pilot yet? No. Okay. Is there any reason for that?
Events, priorities. Simply, we've had a couple of opportunities that were discussed with third parties, but nothing has progressed any further, and I don't expect it to.
Okay, thank you. A successful resolution in the 2021 GWP authorised P&R to enter into new external borrowing facilities up to a total maximum of 200 million for a period of 40 years. Have you missed the boat?
It depends really on your view. The borrowing costs have gone up. I think they're going to continue to go up. Really, this goes back to the original question you asked, is are we trying to do too much? That money was required only if we wanted to do everything that was on the list. And I've said, ever since the first debate, there is far too much in the list. I would not have adopted the approach that we have, and it's why I brought an amendment to the last GWT debate to require that everything that's in the list be ranked according to what individual members want, and then we should draw a red line around what we can afford, and we should just do that. That's my view. But that's a personal view. It doesn't necessarily represent the view of the
it's a
committee.
view I would 100% support. You know, if you had a specific project you wanted to borrow money for, you would know you'd borrow money for that. That makes sense, if the economics are right. But other than that, we haven't been, and again, this is not a criticism of previous assemblies or any assembly, but we haven't been as realistic as we should be.
Okay. Of course, the borrowing wasn't necessarily tied to any particular project, but we will be spending money on capital projects this term. So do you regret that we weren't able to actually secure some funds at the historically low interest rates?
No, because they need to be repaid, and we don't have any means of doing that at the moment because we haven't finished the tax review. It's as simple as that. I've sat down with Standard & Poor's and talked to them about our rating and so on. What external parties who look at our credit rating and credit efficiency want to see is a plan for paying for borrowing if we have it, and we don't have one at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Gabriel.
Thank you. Perhaps a question for Deputy Mahoney as employer representative. We heard from Deputy Fairbrush how important the human capital is, or the resources, the people in the civil service. The 3-year pay deal for the established staff is made up of, in 2022, of 5% increase in £500. In 2023, the RPIX figure from June, which is 7%, and in 2024, the RPIX figure less 1% of the June 23 rates. What methodology was used to determine that this deal is equitable, fair, and a useful tool to retain staff?
Well, working with the HR team and the employee team, and the officers in the background, we looked at what was being done elsewhere, outside of the States. The main reason for the 3-year deal was that having done this once in November 20, I think it was, I realised it became obvious how long this process takes, dealing with the unions across 5,500 public sector staff. The amount of time expended every year is way too disproportionate. So it was felt that there were a better use of time, and of course it gives certainty to all the pay groups. If you have a 3-year deal on the table which you accept, then clearly everyone knows what's coming around the corner and can plan accordingly. There's no confusion about what's coming up next year. Will we get a pay rise next year? If we do, what will it be? We took into account that, by and large, a vast majority of the public sector employees received a 0% pay rise the prior year, obviously with the exception of the Agenda for Change and then the PSEs, who received a small amount. So taking all of those things in the round, looking at what was coming up, those numbers were put together at what we thought was a very fair deal, a very good deal, in fact, was I think my said at the time, and I still believe that to be the case.
And we've heard that the States is still struggling to recruit and retain key staff. Is P&R concerned about the morale within the public sector workforce? And if so, what does P&R consider can be done to improve that situation?
Well, I can only speak for myself, but certainly I think it would be someone strange that didn't think that that wasn't concerned about the welfare of the people that work for the States across every sector. But I think it was Deputy Salisbury said, we have a finite human resource on the island. We know we have vacancies, a large number of vacancies in health, likewise education. We hear from the unions as well as the head teachers and everybody concerned that employment, getting people to come to Ireland is very, very difficult. But in fact, that's not necessarily down to pay, in fact. And if you talk to the Southampton Trust Hospital, they will tell you they are having trouble recruiting nurses. If you talk to the Chief Constable of Hampshire Constabulary, they would say they are having trouble recruiting officers. So whilst it's very easy to point a finger at, well, we're not paying people enough money, then there are other reasons that recruitment is difficult in this day and age. One of them, obviously, is the cost of living, the cost of housing in Guernsey. But that's the same everywhere. If you also look at, that's not a public sector problem, that's a private sector problem as well. If you ask any of the MDs of any of the larger financial institutions or retail businesses, they are having problems that the states are experiencing as well. So this isn't a public sector problem, this is an employment problem on the island.
Adding to the points very well made by Deputy Mahoney, the last thing before we came here, we only finished about 1:30, certainly well after 1. Deputy Hellier and I attended a financial sector forum meeting where we meet representatives of the financial sector, and they are, well, I say moaning is the wrong word, but they are stating about their employment shortages, the difficulties they're having engaging staff, the concerns they have that eventually, if we can't provide decent housing in Guernsey, because that's the number one concern for them. If we can't provide decent housing in Guernsey, those people not only won't come here, the business may go away. So, and I was listening to a programme on Radio 4 2 or 3 weeks ago about nurses, and a nurse had left the profession somewhere up in Manchester to run a coffee shop because she was just burnt out. She was a lady about 45. She was burnt out. She'd been a nurse for 20-something years. And the statistics are horrifying. They're producing far fewer nurses than there are work for nurses. It's just impossible to fill the position. So Guernsey, with the added difficulty of a high cost of living and a shortage of attractive accommodation, is something. And of course, then we get all the difficulties. We argue about whether we should build in a field or not, because we want to protect a few cows, but we don't want to protect our hospital services. So those are considerations that perhaps we ought to bear in mind. I know we may have different views on this panel in relation to that and the new BNR, but I'm just expressing my own view.
Going back, Deputy Mahoney, to the good deal that you described, I understand that about half of the public service workers have not accepted P&R's pay offer yet. So what is the committee's plan B, given that the existence of the industrial tribunal, the industrial disputes law will drive groups in dispute with states to tribunals? Have any budgetary risk or higher settlements been adequately accounted for in the budget?
Yeah, I mean, we say half the staff. Of course, what you actually mean is effectively 2 unions haven't done it. So I accept that may well be half the staff, but we need to be careful with semantics here. It's 2 unions effectively that haven't. That's not entirely. There's other small group, but the people you're talking about obviously are effectively the nurses in the teaching unions, or the NCTLG, which obviously represents or negotiates on behalf of all of the teaching unions. Now, that's a matter that's ongoing, discussions with both of those groups. I'm certainly not going to go into the details of those because the stage that those negotiations are at. But really, that's with them, it's an ongoing situation, and we'll see what we can do. Ultimately, as you mentioned, the IDO is the next stage if those unions deem that that's where they want to go. And there's nothing I can do about that. That's entirely up to the membership of those unions should they wish to take that route.
But has that been budgeted for, or is that a plan B?
Budgeted for in what sense?
Any increase or the IDL?
No. There is nothing in the budget to do.
Okay. I mean, the point has been well made. We've made it publicly. We've made it today. All of 4 of us have made it today in our various contributions. There is no more money. There is no more money. We're going to have a tax debate in January, and the states are going to have to make some difficult decisions. Not only us 4 on this panel, you 3 there, every single person's got to make a difficult decision.
So we've budgeted for a surplus next year of 33 million. I believe you were at the presentation that I gave on the budget. 27 of that is investment return, and I have very little confidence that will turn through. There is no more money to pay additional salaries.
Thank you. Future Harbours and the Development Agency. Deputy Fairbrush, in your routine statement early in September, on the 7th of September, you said, I update you now to where we are with the Development Agency. The political oversight group comprising of Deputies Inda, De Summeray and I selected Mr Stuart Fowler, CBE, to chair the agency. This followed a rigorous and competitive process. Mr Fowler will work with officers and the political oversight group to properly develop further the agency. In the meantime, officers have been directed to draft a revised future harbours requirement policy letter to be submitted to the States by the year end. So my question is this. In June of last year, some 15 months ago, the States Trading and Supervisory Board, which includes Mr Fuller, submitted 7 different options regarding the future harbours to the Assembly in its previous policy letter. These proposals were based on the opinion of subject matter experts who had undertaken extensive background research at not inconsiderable cost and delivered to a project board that was chaired by Mr Fuller. The proposals were rejected, as you know, by the Assembly. What additional insight do you expect to be evident in the next policy letter to be brought by PNR to the States that was not available 15 months ago?
I think it's in relation to saying, look, we've now got a development agency. We've got an agency. It needs to know which way it can go because it will in due course formulate policies, formulate proposed developments, etc. for the states to consider. Now, one of those will be, because it's harbour, it's the eastern seaboard, etc., etc. One of those will be whether there should be a third harbour. Now, the states already made a decision in relation to that, but I think, again, my own view is that it's fair for the states to consider that again by the year end. So it's only another 2 or 3 months. By the year end, to say, is that still the decision of the states? Because there is no further information that will be made available to answer your question. Is that still the decision of the states? Because if it is, fair enough, the development agency knows that that's not a consideration. There's no point then looking at what you could do down at Long Hook or anywhere else because that is cast asunder. Or if the states changes its mind, and the states has on occasions changed its mind in relation to 1 or 2 things over the last X number of years, then they can examine that further. But nobody's gone out and spent another £300,000 or £400,000 on further research.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe the Development Agency will ever be self-financing, or will a future PNR president be standing up in the Assembly saying that it was a mistake of a previous Assembly?
I think it's like everything, isn't it? I think it's going to be difficult, frankly, in the foreseeable future. But whether, an aged Deputy Dalal in 20 years' time as President of Policy and Resources stands up and says, not only is it his 100th birthday, but also he now thinks it can be self-sufficient, we'll have to wait and see.
And how will the Development Agency be occupying itself while it's waiting?
I didn't hear your question.
Oh, I beg your pardon. How will the Development Agency be occupying itself while it's waiting for the outcome of another state's debate on harbours and the production of local planning briefs, a process that is not expected to conclude until the middle of 2024?
Well, what Mr Fuller will be doing, and there will probably by March, I think no later than March, but about March of 2023, we will be bringing forward and saying, look, this is the team, this is, because Mr Fuller's appointment will then have to be confirmed or otherwise by the states. It's probably the wrong phrase, but it's an interim appointment, if I can use that phrase, because he will have to come forward and there'll be a team of people and the states will be able to say, yes, we accept those people or reject those people. But in the interim, we're looking for him to give us advice as to who should be on that panel, how that should be followed through. And also, he and the people that he will engage with won't be sitting there twiddling their thumbs. They'll be coming up with some ideas that can't be properly formulated or approved until we move to the next stage.
Okay, I think a lot of people were surprised or will be surprised to have heard that it's his appointment was an interim appointment. Is it usual practice to wait nearly a year before ratifying someone's appointment?
The phrase I use is an interim appointment because I think that it's still got to be ratified by the states. So it is an appointment until the states will have to approve it. So whatever terminology we use, he is appointed, but the states will have to approve that appointment together with the team in March of 2023.
And if the states fail to approve that, then we'll start the process
then he
again.
won't be appointed. They'll look for somebody else.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Fairclough.
Yeah, I'd like to move on to property rationalisation. As you know, your committee has a responsibility for states' property, whilst ENI and ESS also have certain responsibilities for housing. Do you believe that it would be beneficial to go back to having a single committee being solely responsible for housing in line with the arrangements in place up to 2016?
I can't speak for what the arrangements were up to 2016, but my personal view of that is yes, it would be beneficial.
Is that a view shared by other members of the committee?
That hasn't been discussed at P&R, so...
No, but it's still a fair question to ask. I agree with that view. I think housing, the biggest impediment to Guernsey being able to go forward to provide decent housing for its citizens and to stop businesses developing their business is the lack of affordable housing, either purchase-wise or rental-wise.
Although the previous term and before the latest Machina government changes, it really was a housing department. It was public sector housing, and that was the focus. It wasn't private sector, and in terms of planning, and that as Deputy Burford will know very well, sat with the Environment Department. So it's not quite, although it had housing in the title, gave that impression, it wasn't necessarily covering absolutely everything to do with housing.
Yeah, but I think you were looking at a different kind of housing, weren't you?
Well, I was, but I was just going to come on to, and ask a supplementary question, if I may, to Deputy Salisbury. Is this something that has been looked at as part of the reshaping government work?
Well, yes, clearly we're thinking about. We don't get down the rabbit hole of moving mandates all over the place and then having to change names of different committees and if it's not necessary. But we've also got the tool in the box that I don't think's been used as well as it could be, and I think it could have been used more. Is to have special committee for. We could set up a special committee for housing now if we wanted to, but I think since HAG, the Housing Action Group was and hopefully that will bring some positivity. But,
I think Deputy Gabriel might come onto that particular issue in a moment. But just sticking with housing, I mean, do you believe the plans to increase the island's population? We know we've got a debate coming up on this shortly. Over the coming years, can be matched by the substantial increase in housing that's going to be needed, if that's approved?
Yeah, again, it's got to be looked at carefully. The simple answer is yes, but getting to yes is difficult because you want a yes or a no answer, I think, really. I mean, there is an amendment that's going to be put forward by Deputy de Sommeray and Haskins, which to me looks a credible amendment, is that also we should be looking at what infrastructure we need. It's not only housing, it's all the bits and pieces that we need with infrastructure, that we look at that too. The two they're not in conflict with each other. They seem to me to make sense, because if the States agrees next week, I'm saying a 300, just using that as an example, that would be better for the States. Then we've got to look at what infrastructure we need to make that practical.
I mean, the policy letter refers to as up to around 4,000 new homes potentially going forward. I appreciate that's over the next 15 years or so. I mean, but that is a significant percentage increase in housing locally. Where can all of that housing be built?
Well, that's what we've got to be looked at. But you can't just say, I'm not going to say, because what I find frustrating, I don't think the only person, is that if you want to develop here, it's a no. If you want to develop there, it's a no. The roads aren't big enough, the drains aren't good enough, the so-and-so isn't good enough. That's fine. But people have got to live in reasonable accommodation, whether it's a flat or a house. They've got to have that kind of accommodation. That doesn't mean you build on green fields willy-nilly. You don't do that. But there are sites, I could just think, and I'm not going to name it, I was thinking of a site the other day that's 11 acres. It's completely overgrown binary, completely overgrown. There's rubbish tipped all over it. It would make it an ideal housing development, private housing development. It could be high-rise housing development, etc., etc. Now, I haven't looked into it because it's only occurred to me in the last week or so. I bet there are 97.3 impediments to that being built on, because there's going to be the environment. There's going to be some beetle that will be crushed if there's concrete put on it. There's going to be some neighbour that can see it through a telescope 500 metres away. There's going to be all that kind of consideration, or there's going to be the resolution of 1972, or it was, it's got to revert back to agricultural land, which it's never going to be. We've got to be more proactive. We've got to try and solve problems rather than just create. We are in a housing crisis. Even if we didn't increase the population by one person over the next 15 or 20 years, we've still got to build lots of homes.
And speaking to that point, Deputy Fairbrushe, do you think that the Island Development Plan, strategic land use plan as well, is flexible enough to be able to allow for the...
Why do we have a strategic land use plan of 2012 when the world has changed dramatically over the last 10 years? Now, you've got to have a plan. You've got to have a planning plan, otherwise people will be building houses in fields in Torterville, etc. So you've got to have a plan, but it's got to be much more flexible than the current one. We've got to address
in terms of the review of the island development plan, which
starts next year, isn't it?
Yeah, is that going to come soon enough? We know what a lengthy process that it could be potentially. Is all of that going to be happening quickly enough to be able to allow for the sort of growth that we're talking about?
I suppose that's a question for the DPA. I mean, they've got to understand what the issues are. I mean, we're getting a lot of questions asked about areas which I think probably fall more within their mandate. I understand how we need to coordinate as P&R, but I think that the DPA needs to be well aware of the situation. I'm sure they are well aware of the situation we're in and what they can do to expedite.
Absolutely, but what I was really trying to get at here was the strategic view that needs to be taken of housing. And I know that we've had the Housing Action Group, and we've now got a new version of that tries to take a strategic look at the challenges that the island faces in terms of trying to provide the amount of housing that is necessary.
Well, there is the Strategic Housing Indicator report that will be coming out shortly, and it's a shame we couldn't have had it when we were debating the population and immigration policy letter, but I think that's going to be really important to decide what we actually need, because there's a lot of people who think they know what we need, but I think a lot of work's been done in that to show where the demand is and where we need to focus it, because it's all very well building properties and then finding we can't fill them with the people that we need.
Thank you.
Could I just make a comment? Because we have had some legal advice about this, because we've been looking quite hard at GP11 and the effects it's had on, particularly on building large sites, because then not a single property's been built under that policy since it was brought through. And the problem that we have with the legislation, it's become self-sustaining. So it's not possible for any committee of the states or the states itself to change that policy without having a planning inquiry. So we've literally embedded policy and made it quasi-permanent, which means that we now cannot move fast enough in the crisis situation we find ourselves in without, potentially withdrawing legislation.
So how do we overcome that, Deputy Hellier, in your view?
Well, we can't. Legally, we've created, as I said, a self-sustaining piece of legislation that we can't alter. So if we want to alter GP11 or suspend it or remove it, we would have to have a planning inquiry, and that takes many, many months. So even if we were likely to start that process now, it wouldn't likely to have affected any spades in the ground until after the next election, probably. The only other way to do it would be to withdraw the ordinance, the plans ordinance, under which all of that policy framework is built. But if you do that, you take the whole lot out in one go.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
It's also been claimed that plans to increase the population and the resulting increase, obviously, in demand for housing and services mean that Guernsey will never reach a point where we manage to solve the housing crisis, as demand will always be increasing faster than supply. What's your opinion of that claim? Do you think that is a risk for the state?
Well, I don't think you're ever going to be, unless you take a negative view of life, a negative view of our society and economy, and then it's going to decline. If economically we declined and the population shrunk to, say, I don't know, 50,000, there'd be enough houses. But they'd be cheap, but people wouldn't have jobs, or they wouldn't have well-paid jobs. Our schools wouldn't be as good as they are. Our hospital system wouldn't be as good as it is. People would have to take a significant reduction in living. In a successful economy, you're always going to have housing concerns. But there's a difference between housing concerns, which we're always likely to have, and a housing emergency, which we currently have.
Okay.
I mean, because we're going to have different views when it comes to the policy letter, and Indeed. Some are quite happy to. I don't know where the rest of the committee stand in terms of population increase. I'm concerned. The more people we bring in, it's a Ponzi scheme. The more people we have, the more people we need to look after, and it just grows and grows and grows, and we end up being Hong Kong because we've got to build everything higher and higher. So that does bother me. I think we need to think outside the box on this and think about how can we help and support our population in terms of productivity, in terms of where can we get growth rather than just through more and more people. And I think those are the conversations that I'd like to see more of.
Okay, I think this is a suitable point just to take a 5-minute comfort break. And also, before that happens, I'd just like to thank Deputy Soulsby, because I'm aware she can't stay for the second half. So thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll reconvene at 3:05.
Welcome back to the second half of this public scrutiny hearing. I'd just like to continue where we left off, really, on the subject of property and property rationalisation. And a question probably best directed at yourself, Deputy Mahoney. At the first SMC public hearing with the committee earlier this term, we were advised that you believe the property rationalisation process was taking too long. When can we expect to see a full analysis of surplus state-held property and a proposed course of action for resolving the issue? And will this be in the form of a policy letter to the states?
Yeah, I still believe it's taking too long. But the format that it takes, I don't know whether that's just in a statement to the states or necessarily needs to be a policy letter, I don't think. But I'm happy to do that. We're getting there. The rationalisation obviously is across a large number of properties, and in fact, I suppose with everything in government, things change as you're trying to do them. So the rationalisation, for example, Lucas House and Peruke House, Carrefour House, Somerville and Garden Hill, where we have a whole range of services at the moment. And obviously the plan was to vacate Raymond Fowler House and then move all those services into one big community hub fit for purpose and obviously all in one place rather than 5 or 6 different sites. Now, working with HSC, the proposed residence, if you like, of Raymond Fowler House has increased and increased, such that, in fact, now the desire is to have so many people in there that Raymond Fowler House now can't house all of the people that they'd like to put in there. And that's, I wrote them down because I assumed the question would be coming up. That's people like community nurses, children and family services, speech and language therapy, midwifery, and a whole bunch of others, which was more than we had originally planned to do that. But listening to the officers on HSC, it was clear there would be benefits from having more people together in one place. And so that's meant a redesign effectively of what we can and can't get into at Raymond Fowler House. So that's currently where that's sitting. Now, I had hoped, as I'm sure I've probably made public previously, that we would have had some of those properties sold by now. But of course, we clearly can't sell them until I've got somewhere for them to live, work. So that's why we've experienced delays there. So it's an ongoing matter. I'm happy that whether that's a statement or something, as I say, I don't really see that it should be in the format of a policy letter. I can be persuaded otherwise, but that's where that sits at the moment. Just one follow-up question on that then. Just and using that example that you've mentioned, Raymond Fowler House, which I think is currently being used for a vaccine centre, isn't it, for COVID? What is your approach going to be now then? Because clearly, from what you're saying, you can't get all of the services that ideally you wanted to onto that location. So what are you now looking at? So the plans are being looked at again. There are initial plans for what could go in there without too much work being done. Those plans have had to be revisited. So now new designs are being drawn up by a property services unit internally to see who can go in there. What's obviously at the best, most efficient expense-wise that we can put in there without too much extra expense. So those plans are currently being worked on by Director of Estates and his team. Okay, and just one supplementary from me before we turn to Deputy Gabriel, just on that issue of coming back to the States. I mean, the property rationalisation and the strategic property unit, that has got quite a history to it. It was, I think it's fair to say, and obviously that this was the responsibility of the STSB at one stage. That responsibility then moved across to P&R. But STSB were mandated to come back to the States at some stage once that they'd had a look at the entire state's estate and and how best it could be used to serve the needs of the states and the people of Guernsey. So that's my question about whether it should come back to the States, because it never has done, has it? Since I think I can't even remember the year when STSB were originally sent away to do that. Yeah, I mean, you obviously, with your previous hat on, you would know better what previously happened in the States than I would. But should it come back to the States, my personal view is if you're talking about which services move into a building, I really don't see the need for 40 people to sit and debate that and whether they should decide who moves in and who doesn't move in, or whether a wing is put on there. My personal view is no, that's not required. But if following this I have 39 others writing to me saying you're wrong, then we'll have to reconsider that.
Let's face it. And as soon as sites are talked about, and we've talked about one there, inevitably everyone has a view on it, don't they? That's one of the problems you're dealing with here.
Yeah, that's the price of fish, right? Everyone's got a view on that, but it's I don't know. Does everyone want to have a say in where every building goes? We'll descend into getting zero done. We've got bigger things to look at than whether the midwives sit at Raymond Fowler House or somewhere else.
But you'll keep us up to date on that project.
Yeah.
Deputy Gabriel.
Oh, well, I'm glad you mentioned the State's Property Services Unit, because principal committees have been receiving a roadshow, for want of a better description, presentation by them, and they're identifying strategic property uses and potential changes. What, if any, opportunities for significant cost savings have been identified? And if so, what examples can you give?
Well, really, the ones I gave out to Deputy Fairclough, really. I think I named about 5 or 6 properties there. Now, if we're not maintaining those and we can sell those, then obviously there's a capital receipt, to start with. And of course, we're not maintaining 5, 6 other fairly old buildings by and large, which obviously affects our revenue.
So the plan is to sell those. So previously there's been public disquiet then over certain property disposals in the past. What process does the States of Guernsey follow when selling land and buildings?
For a recommendation from the Property Services Unit. So they'll evaluate. There were a few recently, which I assume is the ones you're referring to, a few old HSC properties which were no longer fit for purpose and hadn't been used by HSC for a number of years. I'm afraid to say had fallen into disrepair. That's an historic matter which I don't think there's any point in visiting. But the recommendation on each of those properties that we sold came directly from Property Services, and P&R took that advice on board.
Deputy Fairbrush mentioned earlier about committees being transparent, and how is that process, or how is the State's Property Services Unit transparent and open in their processes?
I'm not sure how to answer that, because I know what you mean. We're transparent, but that doesn't mean showing you every paper that comes across the desk of P&R in terms of should I sell one Acacia Avenue or should I keep it. That would be, I'm going to assume that other committees have too much work on their plates already than to bother themselves in whether a single property should be sold.
I think the point being driven at here actually is it policy for every property which the States wishes to dispose of to be advertised publicly?
I don't see why we wouldn't. I want as much money as possible for those properties.
Okay,
so yes.
And have any lessons been learnt from any recent sales?
What do you mean by that?
Yeah,
Which properties you talk about?
I don't understand the question.
Because, I think you've really got to be specific rather than say...
Okay, I'll be specific then. The Plat Fougère property.
Well, what's the criticisms of Plat Fougère?
Yeah, sorry. I don't...
No criticism, just have any lessons been learnt from that sale?
I don't know the property you're talking about. So if that's been... if Property Services have sold that, it's not something that's come in front of P&R. I'm happy to be corrected by either Mark or Peter.
Okay, thank you.
But if you employ quality professionals, and the people that work in that property unit are, in my view, although they work very closely with Deputy Mahoney, quality professionals, then you would accept their judgment. I mean, unless you had clear evidence that you were selling something for £100,000 that was worth £500,000, because somebody was knocking on the door saying, I'll pay £500,000. But you can't super analyse every piece of paper that comes before you. If you've got quality professionals giving you what you believe is good, solid advice, then you accept that good, solid advice.
Yeah, I mean, we could look at Upland Road, for example. That property is currently being renovated for the purpose of economic crime team, etc., and potentially some of the law officers. But that was green-lighted by P&R and Home Affairs, and I don't need to receive that we've now decided to put this on this floor and this on that floor. We have professional QSs working for Property Services. We have, a floor on the 7th floor of them that do this for a living. So I don't need to second guess every decision they make.
Okay, thank you.
One of the aspects of the property rationalisation has been, or will be, I think, a reduction in states' employee occupied buildings and a hybrid working policy, which has been referred to previously, where employees work between the office and home. And I think there's some rotational working going on some of the sites now across the states. Are you content that this policy has been correctly researched, implemented and applied? Is it working?
I think by and large it's working. I think with everything where you are making a fairly major change to working conditions, probably the wrong phrase to use, but the way of working, then there are going to be issues that need to be resolved. Not everybody can do it. Not everybody probably wants to do it. So certainly no one is being forced to do it. If people want to work in the office, then there is a desk available for them. So that's obviously still fairly early on in the process of getting that on board. But I've had nobody come to me complaining about it. But if others have spotted that and want to raise it, then they should raise it with myself or the head of the public service.
And how reassured is P&R that working productivity and staff morale is correctly monitored and performance is ensured when it comes to issues like this?
Well, I think we would be led. I mean, P&R, although we have a certain mandate, it's not to have reported into us directly by employees that I don't think that's working, or I certainly haven't received anything. Again, I give way to anybody that wants to tell me they've received stuff from the members of the public that say this isn't working. But those areas, I guess, where people may be affected, I would suspect should be contacting the presidents of Health or Home Affairs or whoever, that they are suggesting, this isn't working properly, planning, for example, or whoever, to say that doesn't work, there's no one at their desk, something needs to be done about this. And if we receive those reports, then obviously we'd be able to look into them.
And have there been cost savings and efficiencies realised as a result of this change in the way of working?
Absolutely. I don't have them today. I wasn't given the question beforehand, so I don't have them to hand, so I can't give those out to you now.
But that's something that you could communicate to Scrutiny. Thank you. Deputy Burford.
Yes. I think Deputy Mahoney, sorry, I think we're still continuing with you. As you'll be aware, there's always considerable public interest in property development because people see how it affects them. Could you therefore please update the panel on any possible progress that has been made on the Cattle Hospital site?
Yeah, the Cattle Hospital site is not dead. It's rather like Mark Twain's obituary. That's still ongoing. So, in fact, I had a conversation with Property Services about that last week. To actually chase where we were on it. So they are still looking at, in the initial phases, I'll call it the hard pan, just for want of a better phrase, where there is currently a building. I'm sure that's not the correct property phrase for it, to see what can be put on there in the first instance. So sort of initial design plans are being drawn up for that.
Okay, and is that for larger houses as was initially suggested?
There are various options being looked at.
Okay, thank
but
you.
For a smaller site, then certainly that wouldn't lend itself to larger houses.
Right, thank you. So that's just on essentially the brownfield part of the site.
Correct.
Yes, thank you. And presumably P&R is also working with HSC on the plans for the key worker housing at the Vocador on the meadow there. Could you update us on any progress in that direction as well?
Yes, I believe we've now had what we were looking for from HSC. It was with them, so we'd done our bit, for want of a better phrase, and we were waiting for HSC to come back. I understand that is now back, so officers are now finalising that S5, but it hasn't been presented to P&R yet.
Do you have a sort of a ballpark figure for when a planning application might go forward?
I don't, I'm afraid. I'd be guessing a number, and I'm not prepared to do that.
But it's not imminent?
If imminent means, is it going to be this week? No.
Or even this year?
I don't know. That doesn't sound very imminent to me, 3 months, but I don't know. I would have to speak to Director of Estates to see exactly what now needs to be done after HSC have done their bit.
I think possibly in states terms, 3 months is imminent.
Oh, well, that might be imminent states terms.
So, Deputy Fairclough.
Yeah, I'd like to just ask a couple of questions, if I may, on the revenue service. Regarding the integration of the revenue service and social security, has the customer experience, in your view, been improved? And if so, has this and is this being measured?
I can answer that one, yeah. I suppose it depends on how you interact with the service and how complicated your affairs are, really. It depends on the extent to which you might have a different experience, because the new system has gone in where we now have electronic submission, for example, of tax returns. But there are significant IT issues in terms of the systems. We are effectively running to the old system and the new system at the same time. And it means that particularly those individuals with complex tax affairs, and when I say complex, I mean not just filling in the basic information on the form, are having to be dealt with in a slower, more manual method. There have been several, well, we've had 2 now, I think, press releases during this year. The first one in July indicated that we had, because of a number of complaints received, we had asked the service to report on its situation. We'd received a report that they were significantly behind in terms of processing, and we asked them to re-resource that. So that in terms of looking at retired staff coming in to help inputting and review, but also looking to the big 4 accountancy firms to take people after the audit season to come in and assist with processing out of date or very late returns. So I think that, from memory, I think they'd done 5,800 additional returns in the period up to the end of June. And since then, they've caught up even further. The issue there is that now we are going to a taxation basis where men and women are being taxed independently of one another if they wish to have it done in that way. It's effectively created 12,000 new customers for the system. So out of a surfeit of wishing to be fair, the States has created itself another complicated problem to fix, which costs more money. So yesterday in PNR, we were asked to vote some further money towards fixing the implementation of the new system. And that, I think, was 5 million. And then there was a recurring cost of, in terms of staff, to ensure that the service is up to date. Because clearly, if we don't collect revenue, we can't pay for public services. So it's absolutely essential that that service is performed correctly. Part of the issue to do with why the new system doesn't work relates to our relationship with Agilicis and the IT system more widely. But that is being addressed, and hopefully will be much more quickly into a position where a lot of the process will be automated for the public and they'll be able to do it all online.
So are you saying was it 5 million or 4.2?
It was no. 5 million. We were asked yesterday, which we approved, for an extra 5 million for capital, as it were.
Right.
What we were told so far in this revenue project, if I could use that phrase, 16 million has been spent of an 18 million budget. Right. But above the 18 million, because I asked whether it was 5 million on top of 16 or 5 million, it's 5 million on top of 18 is needed to bring the project up to finality, so that all the recommendations that were considered are dealt with, and that the system is fully functional and delivering the better service that it should deliver. Because, as Deputy Hellier has said, it's done a bit of it, but because it's a mismatch of old system and new system, it needs to get completely into the new system. Plus, the other figure I was mentioning is a revenue figure, I think, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3, in addition to extra costs that are going to be incurred annually.
That's right. And this goes to what you were talking about before in terms of working from home, because the old revenue system, it is not possible to access it from outside the building. It's not connected to the internet effectively. So because of COVID and staff shortage and so on, that really added significantly with fewer staff in the office to the backlog that had to be sorted through. and that's now coming home to roost. But we are working through it, and the staff are working very hard. I have to say, they've done an amazing job this year in the amount in which they've managed to catch up in such a short space of time.
But the revenue and capital figures that you've just mentioned, those weren't budgeted for.
So
This is extra expense
Yes.
that wasn't anticipated.
Yes, and it's something that we would like Scrutiny, for example, to look at when it considers the Agilitas contract.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Condor.
Yep.
On the 7th of December, it so happened that it was both P&R and economic development statements in the Assembly, and yourself, Deputy Fairbrush, and Deputy Inder both made comments about Condor, which included meeting with Jersey politicians and also meeting with the Chief Executive of Condor on Deputy Inder's behalf. What's the current situation regarding the agreement with Condor, and what process has been made on negotiations with Jersey and Condor on a long-term operating agreement?
Well, Jersey went into purdah for some time because it was coming up to an election, and it went into purdah rather early, I thought. But anyway, that was their business, not ours. They do it their way. When I say they weren't willing to negotiate with us, they didn't negotiate with us over a period of time because they had other considerations. Now, we've had recent meetings with our Jersey colleagues. Deputy Inder has been in discussions with the Chief Executive of Condor, because, as you say, it's economic development, really, P&R as well. We still haven't got a tripartite agreement, which is what we would like between Jersey, Guernsey and Condor, but it's being negotiated. Now, there comes a time when you've got to say enough is enough. We haven't quite reached that point yet, because I believe, I'm not going to guarantee because I can't guarantee the actions of a third party, I believe we will reach an agreement that will be satisfactory to the bailiwick of Guernsey. Now, there's been concerns about scheduling this year. We all know that. Anybody who lives in these islands know that. And I know that very recently indeed Deputy Inder has been taking that up, so that hopefully for 2023 the problems of 2022 are not revisited, and he's taken that up with the Chief Executive of Condor. But you're probably going to ask me about the purchase of a boat. Are you going to ask me about that?
Well, I was going to ask you if the plans were still afloat.
Well, they haven't been. There's been no Exocet missiles yet, as far as I'm aware. But what's happening now? Condor are in discussions of their own with a third party about both buying a vessel and providing their own finance in relation to that. So that's going on. I said many times ago, in fact, I think I first appeared as president of P&R before this august body, that I thought very shortly thereafter we would have a boat afloat. That turned out not to be possible. And that information was given to me in good faith. But as has been said to me, it's not like buying a second-hand car where there are plenty. There are very few of the vessels that are needed to service the bailiwick waters. And they've got to be of a particular type, they've got to be of a particular length, etc., etc. They've got to be of a particular capacity, and they don't come along very often.
Okay. And would your preference be for Condor to provide the vessel rather than the states having to get involved in that?
Well, the states' involvement was through, and Deputy Kelly would know more about that than me, through the Guernsey Investment Fund.
Yeah.
So it would be the Guernsey Investment Fund have to be satisfied that it's a good investment before they advance the funds, and it's done on a commercial basis. But obviously, in an ideal world, the more that a provider can provide themselves, the better.
Okay, thank you. I'll just come back briefly to the scheduling point. I think there's a concern, I would frame it as, that Jersey, having a larger market, has perhaps more negotiating power in terms of favourable scheduling. Do you think that is a problem for Guernsey?
I think it's always been a concern, going back many years. You know, they've got 100 and something thousand people, we've got 60-odd thousand people. So, you know, if you're a provider, you're going to try and provide for the people that, if you've got a preference, you're going to try and go towards those who are going to give you more business. But we've made it very clear in our tenure that that's not satisfactory, and that we've got to be better addressed in relation to passenger services. Because I don't think anybody's complaining about the freight service we get. It's as good as Jersey's. We're satisfied with the freight service we get.
Okay, and ultimately, do you think that Condor's going to require taxpayer support from Guernsey in order to run an additional vessel?
Oh, I think what?
That Condor will require taxpayer support, in other words, states' money towards the operation of an additional vessel?
Well, I think I've just answered that question. That if they do, it will be through the Guernsey Investment Fund, and it'll be looked at as an investment in connection with that. Because even with all the terrors, nobody could have foreseen. You can imagine you're running a passenger service and you've got COVID, so you've got no passengers at all, and you've still got these expensive vessels to maintain. You know, you can't just put them in a harbour and they don't incur costs. Of course they incur costs because they've still got to be looked after. But they still have made a profit, not the kind of return they would have wanted to make on their capital. They've still made a profit. So the routes are profitable. Not so much the passenger services, it's the freight services that make money. As I say, I believe we get good freight service from Condor. But we're not going to allow, we wouldn't allow in any contractual negotiations the freight to be separated from the passenger service.
Okay, that's good to know. Still on the subject of air and sea links, this is your third appearance before this panel. On the first one, you said we will come before the state sooner rather than later with a joined-up air and sea policy. On the second meeting, which was in May, referring to the air and sea policy letter, you said it will come before the states and then it will be a matter for the states. As to precisely when, you know, things sometimes take a bit longer than we anticipate, but it should come relatively soon. So here we are in October. When is this policy letter coming?
I know. It depends what you mean by relatively soon, but I'm not very facetious. I don't believe between May and October is relatively soon.
Well, January and October.
I accept that. We're not the only committee involved in that process, and I'm not criticising any other committee who is involved in that process in relation to it, because before we can bring a policy in connection with air and sea connectivity, we've got to have the issue of sea connectivity dealt with, and that's taking longer than, frankly, I thought, and it's still not resolved. So I wouldn't like to say we're going to come in March or April or May. I would like us to come sooner rather than later. But it's a bit like trying to grab hold of a bar of soap in a shower. It keeps slipping away. But we've got to address it. I mean, we've got to... Condor's contract with Jersey, which, if members will recall, ours is a memorandum of understanding with Condor. Jersey and Condor have actually got a written contract. It's in run-off. The Jersey served a notice quite properly in accordance with the contract, which says by such and such a date, I think it's about another 2.5 years or thereabouts, the contract will end. The idea of that is to make sure that a contract is concluded sooner rather than later, because Condor wouldn't want to run a valuable asset to them is the value of the contract. You know, if you, on their and Deputy Helly would be able to tell you more about that than I am. On their books, on their accounts, they could value the contract. But obviously a 2.5-year contract hasn't got a lot of value. If they can get a 10 or 15-year contract, it has got a lot of value. So it's an incentive for them to come to the negotiating table. But as I say, we did lose, I would think, a good 6-7 months because Jersey, and it's not a criticism, they didn't want to make any active decisions whilst they were in the election period.
I'd just add that having spoken to members of economic development, they have seen the new schedules and have confirmed that they're significantly better than what we've seen this year, which is a real bonus, I think, for the public.
Okay. And if we do get this contract with Condor to your satisfaction, is there still a need for a policy letter after that?
Yes. I think we would still want to bring a policy letter because it is a major commitment. I mean, it would be... I think we would conclude it, but we still want the public and the states are entitled to know what the connectivity issues are, and the states has to resolve them, because air impacts on sea, sea impacts on air, not so much in relation to freight, because obviously 99% or whatever it is of freight comes by sea, but it's still an important issue, so I think it is still a matter for the states.
Okay, thank you. Deputy Gabriel.
Can I just, before that, can I just interject? Sorry. It was just to pick up on a point. I left Deputy Gabriel hanging, and I'm grateful to officers off-site who have come back to me with, I'll read the note direct if you don't mind. Read the sale of Platt Fougere. It was agreed by the previous state's term and sold above independent valuation at that time. We understand it has since been sold following significant investment by the new owner in a much stronger market. So it was previous term, so happy to clarify that.
I knew it was the previous term. Thank you. Going back to you, Deputy Furbush, and still on the question of air travel rather than sea travel generally, in negotiating a robust and reasonable agreement with the states of Alderney for funding the Alderney Airport project, what are the committee's objectives?
Well, the idea is, policy letter will come before the states, and it will be an interesting debate, because there's never the right time to bring something like this, a proposed expenditure of that level for a community of circa 2,000, 2,100, however many people live in Alderney. But the idea is, we've got, if you look at joined up government Guernsey owns an airline called Orkney, which provides services to the Bailiwick of Guernsey. Now, this Policy and Resources, concluded a PSO which had been drifting around for ages. It had been through at least 2 routes before it came to us and was going nowhere. But that runs for till 2025, another 2 and a bit years. We've got a new chairman of Orkney, well, relatively new now, and a relatively new chief executive of Orkney, who have, in my view, are a breath of fresh air. And that's no criticism of the previous incumbents. I just think they are people of real quality who know their business backwards. And the chief executive is saying to us, that's the States of Guernsey, we could save you £800,000 a year on any PSO arrangements going forward if we could get rid of the Dorniers. Because if you think about it, there can't be many airlines as tiny as ours that have got 3 different types of aircraft. The jet, the ATRs and the Dorniers. All pilots are required to have different skills, etc., and it costs a lot to run. Now, Alderney's airfield is a mess. I'm surprised it's lasted as long as it has. It needs great capital expenditure anyway. The terminal is coming towards the end of its life, and that's perhaps euphemistically, it's perhaps beyond the end of its life. It's tatty. The fire service bit that's next door to it that we all know when we visit Alderney, again, needs replacing. Now, they're going to have to be replaced anyway, whether the runway is extended or not. Whether Orkney, whether Orkney receives a PSO going forward or somebody else, I can't see any practical alternative to there being a PSO, a subsidised service to Alderney. Frankly, although things can come out of a clear blue sky, I doubt that there'll be many providers other than Orkney in 2 or 3 years' time providing that service. So we want it provided as economically as we can. Now, Deputy Hellier had an idea, which was an excellent idea, and we all fully supported it, which is that Alderney has got to make some contribution towards it, a capital contribution towards it, because it is a significant capital cost, and they're looking towards doing that. And perhaps, Mark, you could explain what's happened in that regard.
Yeah, so we've worked with the Treasurer and with the Treasurer in Alderney to look at what capacity there might be within Alderney's account. So even though we're effectively in fiscal harmony from an income tax perspective and corporate tax and so on, Alderney now sets its own TRP. It's also, as a result of a States vote, it's entitled to keep the proceeds of the Alderney Gambling Commission, which it uses. But if I'm honest with you, because of spending pressure, and particularly caused by primary healthcare issues that we've had over the last 9 months or so, there is very, very little fat in Alderney's accounts to be able to repay a debt. So we looked at a broad range from 2 million up to 10 million that could be contributed, but that would have to be structured over a longer term to ensure that it was able to cope with the cash flow required to meet the repayments over that period. But it is possible for up to that amount to be done. But if it were the higher amount, then we'd be looking at sort of a 20-25 year term in order for it to be affordable. But that does significantly reduce the additional amount that the States of Guernsey is being asked to do, because the 1948 agreement, our legal obligation to Alderney, really which should have been revised in the 70s, frankly, rather than be left to sort of drag on to now, that requires that we maintain an airfield. It doesn't require that we maintain an air service. There's an important distinction between those two things. And there's an argument as to whether whether the airfield includes some of the ancillary services that go with it, such as maintenance of the terminal building and so on. And so we felt that some sort of contribution from Alderney and a recognition that it is important for their economy, although that doesn't feature very strongly in the policy letter because it's really based around Guernsey's economic argument and the savings for Orkney. But we felt that was important, and it would be important signal for States members in Guernsey to acknowledge that some contribution has been offered.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, just one supplementary on that. Given that that's not part of the policy letter, how are you going to introduce that into the debate, given that it is quite a fundamental, well, it is a fundamental aspect of the whole thing, funding it?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I suppose it's a reflection of the fact that of the discretion that we now have around government work plan and the way in which we fund capex. So the states will agree. It's not like the old system where everything would be costed absolutely, and then people would go out to tender, and the states would provide a 12 million permission, and who would have thought it? The tenders all come at 11,999,099p with a whole load of extra scope of works on top, which is the position the States has found itself in traditionally. All we can reassure is that we have that range of opportunity to make the decision around, because ultimately the States is being asked to commit to another 12 million. The 12 million to do the rehabilitation, which we're legally obliged to do, has already been approved. The propositions are now rehashed to include that extra money, but a significant proportion of that could be provided by Alderney, and I think the State's representatives from Alderney will be commenting on that during the course of the debate.
Okay.
And sorry, just bottoming that out, might we see amendments then from P&R to that end?
It's certainly possible, that we haven't landed on a particular number because we haven't done all the work on what the costings are, and if it was necessary to come back to States members. I also think States of Alderney members are considering making individual approaches to States members here to discuss that approach and how they might cope with some form of capital commitment towards it.
No, I certainly am picking up on what Deputy Fairclough says. I think that if it's designed as a sort of to encourage States members to feel happier towards the proposal, then to have that commitment from Alderney enshrined in resolutions would be a stronger signal.
Okay, that's noted. Thank you.
I'd like to move on to 2023 budget, or the 2022 budget report, and taxation. The in-work poverty review that Scrutiny published in 2018 revealed the real struggles working islanders were having at that time, before all the recent economic crises. The situation locally and globally has deteriorated significantly in the last few months, as has been highlighted earlier. Do you agree that significant systemic change is needed through the tax system to reduce the wide financial inequity on this island and lift hard-working local households out of poverty?
What was that first?
You can have a go. I would like to see some evidence of some of the things you've just made as massive assumptions.
That's why I was pausing for reflection. What I would like to see, this is me, Peter Fairbrush, not President Policy and Resources. I would like to see a states, for example, which states assemblies going back haven't done. Have a look at the Middle Guernsey. I know that's a different. Have a look at what they're going through. They've been going through for a long time. They go through all the points that you've just made about. Well, you haven't. I know what you're thinking. I can sense what you're thinking in relation to that. What have we done for them? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. We're talking about people in poverty and people on benefits, and of course they have to be provided for. But we also have to make sure that the people are out there earning money, educating their kids, paying for their kids perhaps to go to school, paying for their mortgages or their rents. Perhaps a couple working really hard, that we consider them. Not just those who are in poverty. We look at the people who are trying to advance their lives in relation to that. Now, it's not possible to suddenly say, OK, let me just pluck a figure from the air. And Mark will have this more at his fingertips than I do, but I think I understand the point rightly. Let's just say we were to say, OK, all of those earning £60,000 per annum or more, which is well above the average or mean wage, but still is an excessive wage in Guernsey with the price of housing, the price of food and all the other things we talk about. They suddenly pay a lot more income tax. We have progressive income tax from that. I think it would be something like 40%, Mark, is that right? We'd have to put income tax up for those people to 40%. And on top of that, they got social insurance contributions of another 7, 8, 9 and 10%. So 48, 49, 50%.
That only raises half of the amount required in the deficit.
There you are. And Mark's done the arithmetic with us. We've been through it time and time again.
So basically, you're looking at an income tax and social security solution that would be 60% income tax for everyone over £60,000, plus social insurance. If you're self-employed, that's 13%. So you're looking at 73% tax rate.
Which isn't achievable, is it?
I would tend to agree with you. So
I think all three of us agree on that. I'm sure Deputy Mahoney would as well.
Move on to
We've really, in the tax review, fired around all of the opportunities, if we can call them that, but none of them are particularly pleasant, and the proposals that we're kind of narrowing in on now are still not something I don't think any politician would want to impose on the population. But the alternative to that, I'm afraid, is cuts, and significant cuts in public services, and quite significant amounts of money, and that would have a real impact, I think.
So is that the solution then? You know, we've got the wider financial situation is very worrying for Irelanders, and its effect of being felt with mortgage rates going up and food and fuel costs rising. So what measures are P&R considering to alleviate the burden of the cost of living rise to Islanders?
So, I mean, we've held
other
back,
than those in the budget already.
Yeah, I mean, one of them in the budget was to pause mortgage interest relief, for example, which has been phased out for many years now. The control of interest rates is the Bank of England's job, and it's out of our control. But we are in a fiscal union in sterling, so that would affect us. If mortgage rates rose significantly, then we would have to consider re-implementing those rates in order to ensure that that can be provided for and people aren't squeezed in the middle, because as the Chief Minister has said, those who are already on benefits are protected by the uprating and so on that's already been done. We brought an urgent resolution to the States under Article 66 of the Reform Law to bring that forward, to spend some of the extra money that ESS had that hadn't been spent during the year in order to provide for benefits. But very quickly it will be those with mortgages at the lower end of the earnings scale that will be squeezed, and often particularly those with families, and those would be the ones to be targeted. I think we've agreed, and ESS in our discussions with them, that if we're going to provide support, it should be focused on those who need it rather than broadly. So, you know, general cuts in taxation of certain types are not helpful, because they tend to benefit the wealthier more than they do those that need it more. So we would generally look towards things that are more targeted.
Brings me on to my supplementary question then. How is P&R monitoring that? Is that through ENS or through ESS
So
offices?
we've got some quite counter-cyclical noises coming out of the data that we collect. So, for example, ETI receipts are up fairly significantly. So people are earning more, whether that's as a result of a spike, and we saw quite a high, I think I mentioned it in the budget discussion when I did the presentation, but we've seen a bump in dividends and distributions, for example, which we can't really identify why that's happened. We suspect it's as a result of those whose businesses have been curtailed during COVID taking profits out in order to cover their loss of earnings. There are various other steps that we could take in the meanwhile, but we've been extremely lucky, I think, that our energy costs have been reasonably stable because of our relationship with EDF in supplying us electricity through the cable. The bump in oil price, which happened in the summer, has now levelled out and come back down again, although it is still subject to a huge amount of fluctuation. So some of the worst effects of the cost of living rise now have been ameliorated here, and hopefully, touch wood, that will continue on through the winter and into next year, when we expect, the forecasts expect inflation to start to level out.
Thank you. Deputy Burford.
Okay. In the budget that was published recently, there's a 12% increase in spending. Do you feel that we should have tried harder to keep that number lower, given what we know about the difficulty with balancing the books?
We've tried. But what do you say? When you get health come to you and say, and Deputy Hellier's referred to that earlier, the agency costs, because we have figures this morning, we've got over 400 and something vacancies in health and social care out of 451 vacancies out of 2,300 odd full-time equivalent posts, or whatever it is. So 19% vacancies in the health service, and that's wider than just nurses. Now, so they've got to, you can't say to somebody, well, your mother's ill, we can't have nurses looking after her because we can't afford them. We may have to do that in due course if the state doesn't grasp the nettle at the January debate in relation to tax reviews. So Health have come to us and said, look, we've had to employ extra agency nurses, and the cost of that, as Deputy Hellier's explained, is it's about 3 times as much, I think. 3 times as much, but for all the various reasons. So we need another £1.5 million here. We need another £1 million for this. And we've just told you about, it's not in the figures that we've talked about, the £5 million that we've had to approve yesterday for a capital project for the tax system. So there are those costs. They're not wasted. It's not as though the money is being used frivolously. So, but we, the three of us, with our 2 able colleagues, we look at every increase in expenditure claim, or request, I should say, that comes to us with real rigour, but it's very difficult to refuse many of them because they are so well researched, presented, and they're so meritorious. So we could say, and we may have to say, because Deputy has referred to the budget with a £33 million surplus, but 26.9 or 27 million of that is based on the investment return. Now, this year we're going to get nil. Last year we had over 17 million. So we could get nothing next year, or we could get 5 million. If so, we are down to the bare bones. You don't need many uncertainties, many unexpected increases in expenditure to turn what would be a net, but a very small net balance at the end of the day into from turning the black into the red. And that's without us putting any money aside for capital infrastructure. So we've got some very difficult decisions to make in just a few months' time. And I look forward to us making those decisions and you making those decisions.
Sorry.
If I could just add to that, when you asked the question, Deputy Burford, you said, should we? And we is the point, really, because I can't cut anybody's budget. I have one vote in P&R and one vote in the States. Nobody is stopping committees from cutting their budgets now if they feel that they can. It's incumbent on all of us as States members, if we believe that tax will be a huge burden, which it will be on our economy, potentially crippling, to save money. And that applies across the board.
I'd just like to labour this point a bit because, in a way, we've gone full circle back to the funding of the government work plan, and what you're suggesting, and I think everyone's fairly clear about it, is that unless certain decisions, or depending on the decisions that were made in January about the tax debate, that could then or will have an impact on the number of projects that can be funded under the government work plan. But how is it going to be decided? Let's say there isn't enough money to do everything that we want to do. I mean, we're kind of already saying that we're at that stage. But if that becomes clear following January, how then are P&R or indeed the states going to decide what is not done?
Well, I think what would happen is that we P&R would have to come to every state's committee and say, you know what decisions we just made on the 28th of January or 31st of January, whatever day we make the decision. This is the position, that's the likely income going forward in future years, because we talk about future years, 2 or 3 years' time. We've got to sit down with you and you've got to come up with a 5% cut, a 10% cut, or we're suggesting you do. But as Deputy Hellier says, we're not an executive committee. We're not an executive government. So we could say, I'm using health as an example, I'm not saying it's in any way practical or possible. You've got to close this ward and that ward. How could we say that? In the first instance, we've got to say to them, suggest to them, you come up with proposals because they're running health and education's running education, environment's running environment. So those committees would have a far closer day-to-day involvement with their responsibilities than we as P&R do. But ultimately, it would have to be a decision for the states.
But sorry, just...
No, carry on.
If you're talking about 5, 10, 15% cuts to committee budgets, a lot of those things, I'm not saying everything, but will be business as usual things, running schools, running hospital wards, etc. But there is some clarity that's needed between business as usual, things that committees are doing every day under their mandates, and what's in the government work plan. So what is it that would be cut? The business as usual stuff on committees, or is it the stuff that the states already has prioritised within the government work plan?
I think it'll be a bit of both, because we're talking about capital things, obviously, which will fall by the wayside if you've got nothing to pay for them. But also, if you're talking about an annual deficit, then that's revenue stuff you're talking about. So BAU stuff will have to be cut. There's simply no money to pay for all the services that we are currently providing. Won't be enough money to pay for all the services we currently provide at the level we provide them. So I'm glad we're labouring the point, because it's going to be incredibly important in January that every one of the 40 people in that room know exactly what we're talking about here and the consequences of saying no. I don't want to do that. I don't want to make that very difficult and unpopular decision. There will be real world, real life consequences from saying no, as amended, whatever happens. But people have got to realise you can't say no, but I don't know what to do in its place. You've got to have a no, and this is what I will cut. That's real world.
But I think also, in connection with that, we're talking about 2025. So we'll be saying in 2025 or thereabouts, we've just spent all the money on the capital projects like the hospital, etc., that money's provided for. But all we'll have left, we're not talking about the pension monies that are completely sacrosanct and kept apart, like the civil servants' pension monies and what I still call the old age pension monies. You know what I mean by that? I'm not allowed to call that anymore, but I know why I do. But all we'll have is the civil we'll have the what used to be called the rainy day fund. Well, I think we've got about 176 million or thereabouts in that. Now, if you remember, the idea was we'd have a 40 years revenue for that, so we're miles short of that. That's all we'd have left. All we'd have left.
So we have been talking about this in terms of how the tax review is presented to the states when it comes back, because as you'll be aware, we asked all committees to draw up proposals for what services would be cut in the event of a 5, 10 and 15% requirement to cut budgets. And all committees came back with, bar one, all committees came back with suggestions as to how to cut costs. One of the potential structures of the policy letter when it comes back to the states will be either vote for the tax or vote for the cuts, and the schedule at the back will be a list of those services that will be lost as a result of it, of not making the decision, because I don't think we can have the discussion anymore in the abstract. It would have been okay to have that discussion 20 years ago when there was some lee room in the accounts. There is no longer any fat. We are looking at, coming out on a potentially a zero outcome in 2023, and will that recover? It's very, very uncertain.
That's a very interesting point that you make, that may be the format of the policy letter. I'm sure a lot of people will find that interesting. Can I just labour the point just a little bit further, though, on the particularly on the difference between capital and revenue spend? I think it's sort of fairly well understood that if there's a requirement to cut our revenue spend, that, a 5 or 10 or 15% across all committees might be a logical way to do it. However, obviously, if it comes to cutting capital projects, you might have a 60 million project that sits with one committee, a 20 million with another committee, and ultimately you can't say it will only do 70% of that particular project. So it is going to hone in on specific projects. And I think the question is, and maybe this is what Deputy Fairclough was getting to, how will you decide which committees lose their projects?
Well, it won't be for us to decide. It's for the Assembly to decide.
The states.
But the lead will have to come from P&R.
But everybody, in my view, should be given the opportunity to say what their priorities are. Yep. In that, we shouldn't be the ones to say we think you should build this wing of the hospital and that school, and the Assembly should decide this, because I think we went through this process in the first government work plan when it was drawn up, and there was a list of what the priorities were, and it disappeared between the point of the start of that process and the government work plan turning up in a policy letter. I would prefer to see, as I've already said in the States, and as the successful amendment said, members be able to give their feedback as to what they think is the most important thing to build, in this case, CapEx.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on to Deputy Gabriel with question 34, if you could, please, Deputy?
Certainly, yeah. In your recent response to Rule 14 questions about the State's Investment Board, P&R confirmed that unusually there was no local weighting applied in the recent tender process for appointing investment advisors, or indeed any weighting as to the cost, as long as it fitted within an undefined envelope. Do you accept that the tender process therefore resulted in the export of around £750,000 from the local economy at a time when economic development is committed to increasing local procurement by government?
I think I'm going to let Deputy Hellier answer that, because I wasn't personally, I'm not absolving myself from any responsibility, because I'm as responsible as anybody else, but I wasn't personally involved in that process.
I think the question's already been answered in the Rule 14 answer. The reason for not having that local weighting was because we needed to have the best possible service for the 3 billion plus invested, and that didn't necessarily include a local weighting requirement. So the fees are passing outside of the island, but the returns should be better.
Should be or will be?
Oh, I can't predict what I mean, if you give me a tip on the 440 at Chichester, and I'll be in. But no, it's not. All you can do is pick the best advisor through the most rigorous process. I felt the process was too rigorous in a way. It was stultifying to have to go through the process, but it did turn out that particular result.
Okay. I think at that point I would like to thank everybody. We've run out of time, and I promised Deputy Ferbrache that you would only go until 4 o'clock. So thank you to all of the witnesses for attending, and these hearings contribute to the public understanding of the work that government does, in particular in this case the Policy and Resources Committee. And thank you to the members of the media and public for attending and those tuned in to the live stream. Scrutiny undertakes regular public hearing with all principal committees, and we will shortly be updating our website with the next hearing, which is estimated at the moment to be towards the end of November. So thank you all, and the hearing is now closed.
Thank you all. Thanks.